Hello, my name is Cameron Coppin, and today, alongside my colleague, Darrow Fuhs, we will be talking about radio in America. During the early 1930s, American radio was primarily an outlet for entertainment and dedicated little airtime to public affairs. However, that changed after the 1932 kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby and Hitler's annexation of Austria in 1938. And of course, who could forget only 6 months later, on Halloween Eve 1938, many Americans learned of the attack of Mars on United States soil. And Americans learned of this attack while listening to the radios, which was an ever-present mass medium during the 1930s. In fact, at the start of the decade, 12 million American households owned a radio, and by the time of the attack from Mars, that number had exploded to 28 million. Stations around the country aired the War of the Worlds, and when it ended, the radio stations, newspapers, police, fire departments across the country fielded calls from very concerned and frightened citizens. Follow-up research conducted after the broadcast, listeners noted the authenticity of the news bulletin format as contributing to their fears. While introduced as a dramatization and announced at 4 times during the show, the news bulletin approach still convinced almost 2 million listeners that the attack was real. This obviously raised several questions of social responsibility for broadcasters using publicly owned airwaves. In our presentation, we will illustrate how radio was the amplifying voice of Americans, and through radio, various communities found their voice to broadcast messages of social responsibility. We will use the stories from the assigned readings to illustrate this point, and we will also supplement material with a couple of additional selections from scholarly works. Let's talk about the Spiller reading, which describes the use of radio in America during World War II. Now, prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, American mass media generally did not take a stance on global conflicts. This Is War was a weekly radio series comprised of 13 episodes, written, directed, and narrated by the talented Norman Corwin. The purpose of the show was to encourage Americans to support their nation in its war with the Axis. Now, radio was seen as an effective medium to disseminate World War II propaganda because 80% of Americans owned radio sets during World War II. The series, through talented narration of compelling stories, embraced American ideals such as hard work, freedom, democracy, virtue, religion, personal property, while depicting the Axis enemies as the opposite and a threat to the American way of life. The series also aimed to persuade its listeners that former foes such as Great Britain, Russia, and China were united with America in a battle to preserve freedom. Now, this series was very successful. However, by today's standards, according to Spiller, This Is War would be dismissed as manipulative propaganda.
Women Broadcasters of World War II by Jim Grubbs examines the role that women broadcasters played in supporting World War II efforts on the radio. These female disc jockeys and their programs had the sole objective to help boost troop morale. Sexually attractive but not sexually available, G.I. Jill was personified by Martha Wilkerson and her girl next door personality. Martha delivered over 2,000 shows to the troops. Television musical programming during and after the war featured few black entertainers. However, black radio stations and the appeal of black rhythm and blues drew both black and white audiences. White teenagers often hiding from their parents to follow black stations so they could listen to tunes like Blueberry Hill or Long Tall Sally. Throughout the country, black stations were proving popular with both black and whites. By 1954, over 200 radio stations were dedicated to a black format. However, in Birmingham, Alabama, white conservative ownership did little to cover the civil rights activities of the day. While the newspaper and television released disturbing images of peaceful protesters being abused by local police and white citizens, local radio stations stayed quiet. The city was nicknamed Birmingham for the numerous bomb attacks on African Americans. Birmingham's black and white citizens pressured local stations to become more active in their support of the civil rights movement, and the voice of integration started to receive limited airtime. However, news blackouts still made it difficult to rally widespread support for the movement. Eventually, disc jockeys at several of the radio stations helped to mobilize the black community by broadcasting coded messages sharing locations and time for demonstrations. blacks gathered in dozens of Birmingham churches with radios tuned up, waiting to hear a particular gospel song, which was their sign to leave the congregation halls and start marching downtown. Radio cues were behind the Children's March on May 2, 1963, when hundreds of young people marched in protest with over 600 children being arrested, the youngest being 6 years old. The next 4 days, similar marches were held with firefighters turning high-pressure hoses and police dogs on the children. Local media feeds shared these brutal stories across the nation. During the period reflected by these articles, radio shaped, reflected, and participated in America's discussion about war, both across the seas and within our own borders. Americans did not rely on one medium for their news over another. Instead, they depended on constituent parts of an interconnected media system. Radio had an important role. This golden age of radio helped push Americans out of an isolationist perspective and engaged and embraced the world around them.
I found my thrill on Blueberry Hill, on Blueberry Hill.